Okay, Mike Masato, CEO of Staff Driven Dental and the Dental Road Warrior, returning for episode 80 in this series. It had 80 episodes. It's a big milestone. If you've been following me along these almost 3 years of time me doing these, you've spent over 13 hours, roughly, or more of your life listening into my insights and wisdom, and hopefully it's been helpful to you on your practice. I really appreciate you watching these videos and sharing them, and hopefully, as I said, they've been helpful to you and your team. So anyway, today, in celebration of episode 80, I'm going to tell a personal story for you and relate it back to how this can really help you in your practice. And it's a story about my grandfather and some great stories he used to tell me. My grandfather was actually a World War I veteran of the Italian Army, and so this is going back quite some time. My grandfather was an older grandfather, so I never knew him in my youth any less than in his 80s. But what my grandfather was a great storyteller, and he used to tell me a lot of stories. And as a teenager, I was always enthralled by his life because it had some fascinating stories and how it started out, and how he ended up being in the States, and how we came to be. Because actually, if it wasn't for World War I, interesting story, if it wasn't for the war, I wouldn't be here today, and neither would any of my family. So the story is, how it goes is, my grandfather, when you were growing up in Sicily at the time, back in the day, most of you aspired, your parents wanted you to become either a priest or a nun. And he was one of many children. I think it was 10 brothers and sisters, 11 brothers and sisters. A bunch of them became nuns and some became priests. And my grandfather, believe it or not, was on track to do that. And he was actually in a Franciscan monastery somewhere in Sicily, right in the outbreak of World War I, about to take his final vows. But what happened is, one day the Italian army came knocking at the door, pulled out all the young soon-to-be priests and said, guess what? All of you are going to go fight. And at that moment, my grandfather had a decision to make. And he basically said, look, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to kill anybody. And at that, he could have been shot on the spot right now. That's what they did back then. That was considered treasonous, to talk back and say something like, I'm not going to fight. But they took pity on him because he was going to be a priest, and said, understood his conscientious objecting to some degree. And they said, okay, well, you're going to be in the medical corps. So, and my grandfather agreed. So what that entailed, though, if you know anything about the history of World War I, was his job was to be on the front lines of the trenches in trench warfare. And if you saw any movies that are out today about World War I, big one come out recently, it gives you an idea of how horrible it was. Basically, his job was to crawl out into no man's land at nighttime in the dark and pull in the dead and wounded of his fellow soldiers to help save them, or bring the bodies in, recover the bodies at nighttime, whether it was shooting at him, gassing them, and everything else. I don't know how a person survives that with any degree of sanity, but this is what he did night after night for quite some time. We're living in horrific conditions, and these conditions were so horrific in the trenches. He would tell me that he was always an advocate for having things be better for his fellow soldiers, because he couldn't understand why, if they were all on the same side there, on the same team, that the higher-ups in charge weren't taking care of the soldiers. So he would, one time, he tells a famous story to me, he told me he wrote a letter to High Command saying how the food wasn't fit for dogs, and neither were the living conditions, and had this letter sent up to High Command. Well, High Command shows up a few weeks later, lines up all the soldiers in the trenches for a handwriting sample. Because what they were going to do is they were going to find out who this insubordinate soldier was that had the audacity to step up and write a letter to High Command, and they were going to make an example of him, which means they probably would have shot him on the spot. So they basically lined up everyone, they all did a handwriting sample, and they couldn't figure out who it was. Because my grandfather was smart, and he knew this was going to happen, and he had a friend from another unit actually write the letter. So, and the ironic thing is, I asked him, Pop, why'd you do that? He said, well, it was a risk, but guess what? The food got better, and so did the living conditions as a result of that letter. So, again, going way out on a limb on behalf of his team to do that. And there were many stories like that. And now as the war went on, unfortunately, he actually got moved into the infantry as they were short on soldiers, and he was actually wounded and almost killed in one of the biggest battles of World War I, when actually a grenade blew up underneath him, and when he was crossing a riverbank, and somehow he survived, and blown open in his body, and he was put in a little shack while a battle raged outside, and he was by a German soldier and on the other side. And if they had lost that battle, he could have been easily taken prisoner or died or left for dead, but they didn't, and he was taken care of and was able to survive and make it out of the war. And when the war was over, he basically said that, he didn't have the will or desire to go back after what he had seen, and he decided to travel the country and then made his way to the States, met my grandfather. The rest is history. because if that war didn't break out, didn't happen, we would not be here today. And it's miraculous that he was even able to have children, if you think about the nature of his injuries, which I won't get into graphic about, but it was pretty incredible. I remember as a young child, a teenager, feeling the back of his calf where he still had pebbles from the riverbank in his calf of his leg. But this is the kind of person he was. Selfless self-sacrifice on behalf of people. And maybe he learned this from religious teaching, but that's the way he was his entire life. He was always out looking out for other people, taking care of them, having their best interests at heart. And there's a good moral in the story, when you think about your team. Because, you really are the leader of your team, docs, that are doing this and that are running the practice there. And we often forget that. And I know I've spoken about this before at one degree or another, but the leadership quality of really taking your team and making them be number one. One of the basic philosophies I taught way back in this series is that staff is number one and patients should be number two, and everything else should be number two in that practice when you walk in there. Why is that? I'm not saying you should sacrifice and not take care of the patients and neglect the patients, but what I'm saying is you'll go really far, or much farther in practice, when you realize how important and vitally important it is for your team, and you always go to bat for them, and you always got their back, and you're willing to sacrifice on their behalf, and willing to, err on the side of abundance for your team, even if it's at risk to you in some cases. You think about my grandfather, that was like, you're not making life and death decisions every day, being generous to your team or taking care of your team and being there for them and backing them up and not throwing them under the bus and being supportive of them and doing stuff for them above and beyond, because it all comes back to you. It always does. But we're so blind to how we be every day, with our team, and we don't even realize we're sabotaging ourselves here where we are and how we take care of or not take care of them. So be that kind of leader that cares first and foremost about your team. If you have the right team, and again, your team always a reflection of you. You attract what you put out. That's there. And I've had some doctors. One famous doctor told me famously, "My staff hates me." I said, "Well, why would they hate you? You hired these people. You put them there. They're working for you. You're paying for them. What's the reason why they hate you?" What he's really telling you, they're really telling you, Doc, is that statistically they're right on line with most people in this country when it comes to their job, because 75% of people in this country don't like their job or hate their job, and the number one reason why they give is because they hate their boss. Right? Don't be one of those bosses that your team hates. Whether it's errors of omission or errors of commission that you do, be aware of yourself and how you are with them and how you're treating them and how you interact with them every day, and realize these are the people that every dollar in that practice flows through. They make or break you every day. It really would benefit you then to have these people be on your side. Like they have your back, not something in your back, as you've heard me say. That's the kind of team you want there. But you create that by how you be. It starts at the top. It's so important. So as I said, are you going to be that team player that's going to go to bat and go above and beyond for your team? And it'll come back to you. It may not always come back to you with your team. Your team may not appreciate it. They may not get it. Right. Well, that's you just cultivating that culture in your practice. Replacing people as you need be, and that does happen in practice, and you should if you're that unhappy with your team. But you're going to get more happy with your team when you're more happy with yourself. When you start really taking a hard look at yourself and say, what am I doing, and how am I being? What's causing all this around me? If you're not happy in your practice every day, you're not fulfilled in your practice, you're not satisfied with financial things or the way the environment is or how they treat you, how they speak to you, how they interact with you, how far they go above and beyond for you. That is all a reflection of who you are, right? And what you're doing and how you're being with them every single day in the practice. And you need to go and this is a blind spot for so many doctors. This is where the coaching comes in, and I've been preaching this forever. So if you're involved in a coaching program, a training program, and it's just not going the way you think it's going to go, the coaching is the easy part. Making changes in the practice and changing systems and policies, and that's the easy stuff. Changing yourself and looking at yourself in the mirror and holding up that mirror of self-analysis to say, look, I got to look at myself and I got to be better and I got to change because maybe it's me, right? That's the most difficult part. And that's where the power of good coaching comes in, where a coach will show you, like, look, it's not about just showing up and going through the motions and implementing a program and opening up a binder and say, here's a script for that, or here's a system for that, or here's a policy for that. It's a lot deeper than that. It's changing yourself. So again, be more an embodiment of what I was talking about being a leader in your practice that has the best interest of your team at heart, number one, at all times. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this little story and this celebration of my 80th episode. Hope to be around for 80 more. Please continue to share these videos, and I'll be back before you know it with another episode.